Sincere apologies for the technical issue that we had, but what we've decided to do is to just have the do a separate Q&A session and answer those questions that we posted. So the first question I'm going to ask Stephen. So a lot of councils are actively moving away from making calls as a part of their digital strategy. So how do voice calls fit with the wider digital strategy?
Yeah, I see where you're coming from there, Karen. When we talk about phone calls, it seems to be kind of a bit of an old school technology compared to some more digital, more progressive digital approaches. So what role how do we kind of square that circle? And I mentioned in my presentation the difference between a digital strategy that is kind of digital by design and one that is digital by default. And I think that's a key differentiation really to make in this context. So the difference for me there is that if we're being digital by design, then we're using those digital channels and services in a more targeted way. We're not just taking a blanket approach to migrating as many services and interactions online as possible. And for me, that's where the behavioural science comes in and has a role to play, because we know that for some residents and for some interactions, digital channels or services are likely to result in suboptimal outcomes from a behavioural point of view. We might get a short-term efficiency gain, but often that turns into a false economy in the longer term if we end up creating failure demand through selecting the wrong channel or reducing the propensity to engage, or as we've seen in the presentation, reducing satisfaction. So for me, that's exactly why voice has a key role to play within a digital strategy, because it is that digital design mindset. We are using digital channels where they are appropriate and where they drive optimal outcomes, but we're also using other channels like phone and the power of voice for those interactions where those digital channels and services wouldn't be appropriate. And that fits in a digital strategy because we're using technology to optimize how efficiently we can have those voice conversations. So it does sound like a bit of a paradox there for phone calls and a digital strategy, but I think it does come together. It is a circle that is squared.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you, Stephen, for that. And just a question for you, Mark. What are the savings in manpower resource have you experienced in general?
It's really hard to quantify because so much happens within a normal council tax process, whereby we're already making outbound calls, or customers are making inbound calls. It's actually quite difficult to put a particular amount on it. But one thing I would say is if we were to sit a member or a couple of members of staff down and say, go away and make 2,000 calls, even if you just look at it for 5 minutes a call, I think that works out at 166 hours worth of calling. So really, you wouldn't really want a member of staff or a couple of members of staff away from your normal business for 166 hours. And bearing in mind when we actually did this on our evening shift, we were only getting a 5% success rate. So, right. but really, I think what we're saying though is aside from all of that, there are lots and lots of other savings that are probably quite difficult to quantify around, around us actually making an outbound call at some point in the process, or even when we've actually contacted the customer and agreed an arrangement. At that point, there's no further need for any of the further recovery letters. So there's potential savings that are recognisable around the post that we send, and some of the other parts of the billing process that really it saves you by getting into the customer early on in the process.
And I'm just going to extend on that question as well. I've got another question. What has the reaction been from the team, and did they have any reservations about the system?
Yeah, from the team itself, from Revs and Ben's staff, I think many of us, myself included, were worried that customers wouldn't engage because they haven't engaged previously when we've tried the other methods. We definitely feel that some of the preparation that we did around the message and the consequence, and also the training we did for staff has helped us. But overall, really, the team really like the product and like to use it, and we definitely want to roll it out more in the future. That's
great. This is a question for you, Stephen. You mentioned that trust and relationship influences residents' behaviour. Can you talk a bit more about how that works?
Yeah, sure, Karen. I mean, it is a fascinating area, something that I'm personally really interested in at the moment. But I think it's something that the evidence is only really starting to get to grips with, really. So in the presentation, I mentioned the link between communication and trust, and how communication is a key driver of trust. But the other component in there that I didn't mention is perceived fairness. So the extent to which a resident feels like they've been treated fairly by the council in this context, but services more generally. So fundamentally, as human beings, we're driven by a sense of fairness and justice. And some studies showed that this actually could be innate. You know, children as young as 3 are displaying this sense of needing to kind of redress the balance if they feel hard done by, or see other people being hard done by. So if we feel treated unfairly, or we see other people being treated unfairly, we seem to have this innate drive to restore that balance, to get some sort of kind of payback or justice. So that's the science bit. But then if we translate that into the context of relationships with residents, if they feel treated unfairly by the council, then we're hypothesizing that this will be reflected in their behaviours, and kind of mediated by this innate desire for justice, so some sense of payback. So in very basic terms, if they feel treated unfairly, and feel treated unfairly, and perceived fairness is the key thing. You know, we may not feel that we are treating them unfairly, but if for whatever reason they feel that, that's the key thing. But that results in them being less likely to engage, potentially less likely to pay on time, keep up repayment arrangements, supply information that we need from them on a timely basis, and a host of other compliance behaviours that ultimately require council resource to deal with. So it's that sense that the trust, relationships, and that notion of perceived fairness drives customer behaviours for various reasons that then result in increased demand.
That's great. Thanks, Stephen. And back across to yourself, Mark. I think you started touching on this on your last question. And do you have any plans to extend the use of the system within the department? Yeah,
some of my colleagues are probably, I would say, queuing up to actually have a little bit of the technology, which is all great. Although from a project management point of view, there's a whole boatload of work that I'll probably have to try and factor in. So we talked about in my presentation around what we've done for council tax. We actually want to use it for lots of different stages of the council tax process. We didn't really touch in that we also did a little mini trial on housing benefit overpayment collection, and that was similarly successful. We would want to extend it out within that service. And we'd also done a little bit of work on a very small pilot around chasing up people for where they'd put in a claim for council tax reduction, that said they were going to provide us with further information, and we were actually using Voicescape to call them, to remind them of the letter that we previously sent, tried to get the information over the phone and actually get them a bill that day, so that we could then say, right, are we going to get a payment? Are we going to get an arrangement? But beyond that, there's things like collection of business rates, there's accounts receivable, we have car parking fines, and that's really just to name the first few who I've spoken to within the service who said, we could make use of that. Wider in the council engages with customers every day for hundreds of reasons, and it's an engagement tool. So there are so many other uses, and I think really we're only just scratching the surface with what we're doing at Middlesbrough. And in fact, we've got a meeting fairly soon where we're actually going to start to explore how it might work for perhaps getting in touch with adult social care customers, or getting in touch for just feedback about service, or whatever else you really. It's sort of like there's no limit really, I think, to what we can use this software for. And I know in the presentation you gave some feedback around customer feedback. Did the customers have to be reassured about it was Middlesbrough that was actually calling you? What sort of things did you put in place so they knew it wasn't a scam? So usually the call linked to something having already happened. So a bill had gone out, a reminder had gone out, a final notice. So if you like, from the timing of it, it linked to something that was relatively fresh in the customer's mind. But then the second thing, really, it was coming from a local number. So in Teesside, our STD code is 01642. The number that the customer saw was an 01642 number. So that was the second piece, if you like. Thirdly, is that some customers, when we spoke to them, we were obviously saying, were you comfortable with this? And they said what they'd done is they'd actually hung up on the call, but they'd Googled the number to tell me who's rung me. And on the advice of some of your Voicescape colleagues, we actually put on our website, our council tax collections website, the number in all the different forms, with a space, without a space, with brackets. And what happened then is Google brings Middlesbrough Council's council tax collection page top of the search. So those customers were really, really nervous. They were obviously able to see that. And then there was a few who were a little bit cautious about ringing the line. And in fact, what they did is they came through on our other line. So they came through and said, I've been contacted by somebody saying they're from Middlesbrough Council. Was it you? Well, once we saw the number, yes, it was. We then able to put them through the Voicescape line, and they were able to then deal with the operator about their arrears. So overall, it kind of all rolled up. It was a number of things that kind of rolled together as one. But I think the really good thing is, apart from the good feedback, we didn't get any complaints at all out of the 2,000 contacts that we made. So, and I monitored the complaints, so I can tell you firsthand that we didn't have anything.
Great. Thank you for that. I think this is the last question for you, Stephen. More and more councils are starting to use behavioural insights. So what do you think they can be best used to help Revs and Ben's team?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We are seeing behavioural insights being used more and more within a council context. The behavioural insights team have done a lot of good work around that, and the LGA specifically, they've done a lot of good work to kind of raise awareness and build capability, capacity around the application of behavioural insights. I think the key thing is, in Revs and Bens, but more generally, is that the majority of that work has been done around kind of nudge-based principles. So how we can use nudge-style interventions, so small tweaks to letters and small tweaks to other sorts of service nodes to drive behaviours. And that's fine. That's an important part of how we can have an impact. But I think going forward, it needs to kind of expand out from that focus on nudge to look at how behavioural insights can be applied more generally, because it's a much kind of broader toolbox, so to speak, than just nudge techniques. So within our own work, for instance, we use a lot of behavioural segmentation work. This for us is kind of data science, but it's part of that behavioural insights approach. So understanding which groups of people within the population are more likely to miss a payment, adopt a certain payment behaviour, represent different sorts of risk related to payment behaviours and arrears, etc. So there's that element that I think would add further value. And that then also speaks to the propensity to pay question, which I know a lot of Revs and Bens teams are working hard to get to grips with. Where do we focus the resource? If we had a sense, kind of an evidence-based sense of which customers are more likely to pay, then, some would argue that's where the resource needs to go, because there's some low-hanging fruit there. And again, for me, that's all part of the behavioural approach, understanding which behaviours are more likely to kind of be manifest. I think one extra element just in there as well is, again, as part of our own work, there's that behavioural science element, there's that kind of data science piece, but there's also that important element of kind of understanding what's going on in the lives of our residents, asking that why question. Why are people struggling to pay? Why are they not engaging? Why are they struggling to maintain that repayment arrangement? So backing all that science, that kind of quantitative science, up with some qualitative research to get a real understanding of what's driving resident behaviours, and then feeding that back into service design and potentially into the training of staff and how they deal with their interactions. So I think the nudge work has been brilliant, and there's a lot of learning to take away from that, but I think it's just scratching the surface as far as the impact that behavioural insights could potentially have on Revs and Ben's performance.
Excellent, great, thank you. And I think this is the last question for yourself, Mark, and it's around compliance. And what did your compliance team have any reservations or any concerns around the system around GDPR?
So yeah, we had to do a data protection impact assessment. We had to involve our data protection officer. We absolutely would not want to be passing any personal details over to Voicescape that would be able to identify a specific customer. And so I think the beauty of this is when we were talking to you about the format of any file that we uploaded, we actually only uploading two things. We're only uploading a council tax account number and a telephone number. Nothing to say that belongs to anyone in particular. And I think the beauty of the technology when it works in conjunction with our telephony system is when that customer then comes through to the telephone line, the operator gets a whisper in their ear, which tells them that council tax account number. And that's the point that we marry the customer that's on the phone with the detail that we just got in our ear to pull their details up on our account. So if anyone were to have intercepted the file upload, and I know it's a secure transfer, so the chances are it's not likely, but if that was to have happened, or if Voicescape, had staff who were able to see our file, there's nothing on that file that actually identifies a specific customer at that stage. So it works really, really well for us, and that's the way that certainly we'll continue to upload our data in the future.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, thank you very much both for doing the Q&A as a separate session. And thank you very much for all of you for joining, and sincere apologies for the technical hitch that we had at the end. And as I said previously, both Mark and myself would be more than happy to have an offline conversation with you. Thanks very much.